The cold barrel of the gun pressed against Preston Elliott's temple didn't frighten him half as much as the thought of his 6-year-old son growing up without a father. It was 1874, and death came easily in the untamed territory of Wyoming. But not today. Not like this. "I ain't gonna ask again," growled the bearded outlaw, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Where's the money, Elliott?" Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the small photograph on his desk, his late wife Sarah holding their newborn son Thomas. "I told you, Harker, I don't have it anymore. The bank took everything when the drought killed my cattle." The outlaw's finger tightened on the trigger. "You got one more chance to—" A sharp rap at the door interrupted him. "Pa! Pa! I'm ready for school!" The outlaw froze, then quickly stepped back, lowering his gun as Thomas's voice called through the wooden door. "Don't you breathe a word," Harker whispered, tucking his revolver inside his coat. "This ain't over." Preston straightened his collar, forced a smile, and opened the door to find his son clutching a slate board and chalk, his dark hair neatly combed, wearing his only good shirt. "Just a minute, Thomas. Mr. Harker was just leaving." Preston's voice remained steady despite the tremor in his hands. Harker tipped his hat with mock politeness. "We'll finish our business soon, Elliott." He brushed past Thomas, ruffling the boy's hair with calloused fingers. When the door closed, Preston knelt before his son, checking his face. "Do you have everything you need for your first day?" Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir. Miss Jenkins said I only need my slate and my letters." Preston smiled, marveling at how much the boy resembled Sarah, the same deep brown eyes, the determined set of his small jaw. 3 years had passed since influenza had taken her, leaving Preston to raise their son alone in this unforgiving frontier town of Cottonwood Springs. "Then let's not keep her waiting." They walked hand in hand down the dirt road, Thomas chattering excitedly about the schoolhouse and how Billy Thompson had said they might get to see real books with pictures. Preston listened, nodding at neighbors while his mind raced with the problem of Harker and the debt that had followed him from Texas. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple clapboard building with a small bell tower. Several children were already gathered in the yard, watched over by a young woman with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. "That's her, Pa," Thomas whispered. "That's Miss Jenkins." Preston had seen Cottonwood's new schoolteacher from a distance since her arrival 2 months ago. The town had buzzed with gossip about the educated Eastern woman who'd come west to teach. What he hadn't expected was the way his heart quickened when she looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Elliott," she called, approaching them with a graceful stride. "And this must be Thomas." "Miss Jenkins." Preston removed his hat. "This is indeed my boy." Katherine Jenkins extended her hand, not to Preston, but to Thomas. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Thomas. Are you ready to learn your sums and letters today?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam. I already know some letters. Pa's been teaching me." She glanced up at Preston, her green eyes warm with approval. "Has he now? Then you'll have a fine head start." Preston felt suddenly conscious of his worn coat and the dust on his boots. Katherine Jenkins, with her proper Eastern diction and clean-pressed dress, seemed to belong to another world entirely. "He's a quick study," Preston said. "Gets that from his mother." A shadow of understanding crossed her face. Everyone in town knew Preston Elliott was a widower. Thomas tugged at Preston's hand. "Can I go play with Billy before school starts, Pa?" "May I?" Katherine corrected gently. "May I go play, Pa?" Preston nodded, and Thomas raced off to join the other children, his concerns about his first day apparently forgotten. "He'll do fine, Mr. Elliott," Katherine said, watching Thomas. "Just like his father, I suspect." Preston's eyebrows raised. "You don't know much about me, Miss Jenkins." "I know more than you might think." She smiled, revealing a small dimple in her left cheek. "Small towns have big ears. They say you're a hard worker, honest to a fault, and that you've done a remarkable job raising that boy alone." Heat rose in Preston's face. "People talk too much. Sometimes they say true things." She glanced toward the children. "I should ring the bell. First day and all." As she turned to leave, Preston found himself speaking without thinking. "Miss Jenkins, I was wondering if you might—" The crack of a gunshot from town cut through the morning air. Children screamed and parents rushed forward as Preston instinctively pushed Katherine behind him, his hand reaching for a gun he no longer carried. "Get the children inside," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. Katherine didn't hesitate. She rang the school bell with 3 sharp pulls, then began ushering children toward the door. "Inside, quickly now. Thomas, Billy, come along." Preston scanned the distance, his jaw tight. More gunshots followed, along with shouting from the direction of the bank. Sheriff Wade emerged from his office down the street, buckling on his gun belt as he ran toward the commotion. Preston recognized Harker's voice among the shouts and felt ice in his veins. "Pa?" Thomas stood in the schoolhouse doorway, his small face pinched with worry. "Go inside, son. Do exactly as Miss Jenkins tells you." Katherine appeared beside Thomas. "Mr. Elliott, please be careful." Preston nodded once, then turned and ran toward the sound of gunfire, knowing he was running straight toward the man who'd threatened his life not 30 minutes earlier. The bank's front window was shattered, and 2 bodies lay motionless in the street. Preston recognized one as young Deputy Collins. The other wore the dusty clothes of a drifter, one of Harker's gang, likely. Sheriff Wade crouched behind a water trough, exchanging fire with men inside the bank. "Elliott, get down!" he shouted when he spotted Preston. Preston dove behind a hitching post as a bullet splintered wood near his head. "How many?" he called to Wade. "3, maybe 4, the sheriff answered between shots. "That bastard Harker and his boys." "Anyone else inside?" "Bank manager and 2 customers, maybe more." Preston's mind raced. Harker had come to him first, thinking he still had money from the cattle sale years ago. Finding nothing, he'd moved on to the bank itself. The timing couldn't be coincidence. "I'm going around back," Preston called. "Elliott, don't be a damn fool. You're not wearing a badge anymore." But Preston was already moving, staying low as he circled behind the neighboring buildings. His past as a Texas Ranger wasn't common knowledge in Cottonwood Springs, but Wade had known since Preston first arrived with a nursing wife and infant son, looking for a quiet place to start over. The back door of the bank was unguarded, propped slightly open for a quick escape. Preston paused, listening to the shouts inside. He recognized Harker's voice, demanding that the safe be opened. Taking a deep breath, Preston slipped inside, finding himself in a small storage room. Through the partially open door, he could see the main floor of the bank where Harker and 2 others held guns on the terrified bank manager. "You've got 3 seconds before I put a hole in your head," Harker was saying, pressing his revolver against the manager's temple. 1, 2. "It's on a time lock," the manager cried. "I told you, it won't open until noon." Harker cursed, then struck the man with his gun. "Then you're of no use to me." Before Harker could pull the trigger, Preston charged through the door. "Harker!" 3 guns swiveled toward him. Preston had no weapon, nothing but the element of surprise. "Elliott?" Harker's momentary confusion gave Preston the opening he needed. He lunged forward, tackling Harker around the waist. They crashed into a desk, sending papers flying. Harker's gun discharged, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling as they struggled. The other outlaws hesitated, unable to shoot without hitting their leader. Outside, the sheriff's voice called for surrender as more gunfire erupted. Preston managed to wrench the gun from Harker's hand and slam it into the outlaw's face. Bone crunched beneath the metal as Harker howled in pain. One of the other men fired, grazing Preston's arm. He grunted, rolled away from Harker, and came up with the outlaw's gun in his hand. 2 quick shots, and both men fell. Harker, blood streaming from his broken nose, scrambled for one of his fallen comrades' weapons. "I'll kill you, Elliott, I swear." Another shot rang out, and Harker collapsed, a red stain spreading across his chest. Sheriff Wade stood in the front doorway, rifle still aimed. "I told you to stay out of it," Wade said, lowering his weapon as he approached. Preston winced, clutching his bleeding arm. "Never was good at following orders. That's why I quit wearing a badge." "Lucky for us, you didn't forget everything they taught you in Texas." Wade helped the shaken bank manager to his feet. Everyone all right? As the shock of the moment faded, Preston remembered. Thomas, I need to get back to the school. Go on, Wade said. I'll handle this mess. By the time Preston reached the schoolhouse, a crowd of worried parents had already gathered. Katherine stood on the steps, attempting to reassure them while keeping the children inside and calm. Her face paled when she saw the blood on Preston's sleeve. Mr. Elliott, you're hurt. It's nothing, he said, though the burning pain suggested otherwise. Just a scratch. Thomas has been worried sick. She turned to the anxious parents. The danger has passed. Sheriff Wade has the situation under control. Please, give us a few more minutes to settle the children. Then you may come collect them if you wish. As the murmuring crowd dispersed slightly, Katherine took Preston's uninjured arm and led him inside. 20 pairs of wide, frightened eyes turned to them as they entered. Pa! Thomas broke from the group and ran to Preston, wrapping his arms around his father's waist. Preston knelt, ignoring the pain shooting through his arm, and embraced his son. It's all right, Thomas. Everything's fine now. You're bleeding, Thomas cried, tears welling in his eyes. Just a scratch, Preston repeated. Nothing to worry about. Katherine gently intervened. Children, please continue with your drawings while I help Mr. Elliott. Miss Caroline, would you watch them for a moment? She nodded to the young assistant teacher who'd been reading to the youngest children. Preston allowed Katherine to guide him to a small adjacent room that served as her office. She closed the door partway and gestured for him to sit. Take off your coat, she ordered, retrieving a basin of water and clean cloths from a shelf. Preston raised an eyebrow. That's rather forward, Miss Jenkins. A blush colored her cheeks, but she remained firm. Don't be difficult, Mr. Elliott. I need to see how bad that scratch really is. He complied, wincing as he removed his coat to reveal a torn and bloodied shirt sleeve. Katherine carefully rolled it up, exposing a deep furrow across his upper arm where the bullet had grazed him. This needs proper tending, she said, gently cleaning away the blood. But I think you'll survive, provided infection doesn't set in. Had worse, Preston murmured, watching her skilled hands work. Where does schoolteacher learn to dress wounds? I volunteered as a nurse during the war. Her voice softened. Charleston Field Hospital, 1864. Preston studied her face, realizing she was older than he'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 29. Not the fresh-faced girl of 23 he'd assumed. The war would have been her formative years. You're a long way from Charleston. She tied off the makeshift bandage with practiced efficiency. As are you from Texas, Mr. Elliott. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was understanding in her gaze, the kind that comes from recognizing another soul who has seen too much. A small face appeared in the doorway, breaking the moment. Is Pa going to be okay? Thomas asked, his voice small. Katherine smiled. Your father will be just fine. He's very brave. I know, Thomas said with absolute certainty. He used to catch bad men in Texas. That's what Ma told me before she went to heaven. Preston cleared his throat. Thomas, maybe you should join the other children. But I want to stay with you. Katherine knelt to Thomas's level. Tell you what, today has been quite exciting, hasn't it? I think perhaps we should postpone our first day of proper lessons until tomorrow. Would you like to help me read a story to everyone instead? Thomas's face brightened. Can it be the one about the cowboy and the wild horse? That sounds perfect. She stood, offering her hand to the boy. Mr. Elliott, you're welcome to stay as well if you'd like. Preston rose, testing his bandaged arm. Thank you, but I should check on the sheriff, see if he needs any help. Katherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course. Thomas will be safe here with me. As Preston stepped out into the bright Wyoming sun, he found himself looking back at the schoolhouse with an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. It had been 3 years since Sarah's death, 3 years of focusing solely on survival and raising his son. For the first time, he felt something stir within him, something he'd thought had died alongside his wife. Fool, he muttered to himself as he walked toward town. A widower with a dangerous past had no business thinking about a refined schoolteacher from Charleston, but as he reached the main street, he couldn't help glancing back once more. Katherine stood in the schoolhouse doorway, watching him go, Thomas by her side. The next morning, despite a throbbing arm and a sleepless night, Preston once again walked Thomas to school. The town was abuzz with talk of the foiled bank robbery. 3 outlaws dead, 1 wounded and locked in the jail, and Preston Elliott, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, suddenly the subject of speculation. "They're saying you used to be some kind of lawman," said Miller, the blacksmith, as Preston passed his shop. Preston merely nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "Pa was a Texas Ranger," Thomas announced proudly. "The toughest one they had." Preston squeezed his son's hand. "That was a long time ago, son." When they reached the schoolhouse, Katherine was already outside, greeting each child by name. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair arranged more practically than the day before. "Good morning, Thomas," she said warmly. "I'm so glad you decided to return after yesterday's excitement." "I ain't scared," Thomas declared. "Pa says being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." Katherine's eyes lifted to Preston's. "Your father is a wise man." Thomas ran off to join the other children, leaving Preston standing awkwardly before the schoolteacher. "How's your arm?" she asked. "Stiff, but healing." He shifted his weight. "Miss Jenkins, I wanted to thank you for yesterday. For keeping Thomas safe and for—" He gestured vaguely toward his bandaged arm. "Katherine," she said, "I beg your pardon?" "My name is Katherine. When we're not in front of the children, I'd prefer you call me Katherine." A small smile tugged at Preston's lips. "Then I suppose I'm Preston." "Preston," she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you." The school bell rang, summoning the children inside. Katherine lingered a moment longer. "Will you be walking Thomas home after school today?" "I always do," she smiled. "Then perhaps we might have a chance to talk further." As Preston turned to leave, Sheriff Wade approached, his expression serious. "Elliott, got a moment?" They walked a short distance from the schoolhouse before Wade spoke again. "The outlaw that survived, he's talking. Says Harker was after you specifically. Something about money you owe?" Preston sighed. "Not money I owe, money he thought I had. Back in Texas, I was part of a ranger company that recovered a large sum stolen from the Galveston Bank. Harker was part of the gang, but he escaped. The money was returned to the bank, every dollar, but Harker never believed that. He's been tracking me for years, thinking I kept some of it." Wade studied him carefully. "And did you?" "No." Preston met his gaze steadily. "I've never stolen so much as a penny." After a moment, Wade nodded. "I believe you, but there's more. The prisoner says Harker wasn't working alone. He had a partner, someone who's still out there, someone who knows about you." A chill ran through Preston. "Did he give a name?" "No." "Just said we haven't seen the last of this?" Wade adjusted his hat. "Thought you should know. Might want to watch your back." As the sheriff walked away, Preston looked back at the schoolhouse where his son was now safely inside with Katherine. He'd come to Cottonwood Springs to escape his past, to give Thomas a peaceful life. Now it seemed the past had found them anyway. Throughout the day, Preston found himself glancing repeatedly toward the schoolhouse as he worked at odd jobs around town. With his small ranch struggling, he'd been taking whatever work he could find, mending fences, breaking horses for the livery, even helping the undertaker prepare the outlaws' bodies for burial. By mid-afternoon, he was at the general store, unloading supplies from a freight wagon, when he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "Don't think it's proper. A young unmarried woman living alone like that," Mrs. Whitfield, the preacher's wife, was saying to Mrs. Miller. "And now this business with the Elliott man. People are talking." "It's just a bandage, Beatrice," Mrs. Miller replied. "It's not as though she invited him to her home." "Not yet, perhaps, but I've seen how she looks at him. A widow with a young son, it's practically a storybook situation for a woman approaching 30 with no prospects." Preston set down a heavy sack of flour with more force than necessary, causing both women to jump. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, tipping his hat as he passed them. Their embarrassed murmurs followed him out of the store. By the time the school day ended, Preston was waiting outside the schoolhouse, his mood darkened by both physical pain and the whispers he'd heard around town. The last thing he wanted was to cause problems for Katherine. The children burst out of the schoolhouse like a flock of startled birds. Thomas ran to him, clutching a piece of paper. "Pa, look what I made! Miss Jenkins says I draw really good horses." Preston examined the childish sketch, genuinely impressed by his son's eye for detail. "That's fine work, Thomas. Really fine." Katherine appeared in the doorway, watching them with a smile. She dismissed the last of the children, then approached. "He has a natural talent," she said. "I hope you'll encourage it." "Of course." Preston hesitated. "Miss Jenkins, Katherine, I need to speak with you about something." She tilted her head slightly. "Is everything all right?" "Thomas, why don't you go see if Mr. Miller's new puppies are in the yard?" Preston suggested, handing his son a penny. "Maybe Mrs. Miller has some candy, too." When Thomas was out of earshot, Preston spoke quietly. "I've heard talk in town about you tending my wound, about propriety." Katherine's expression hardened slightly. "I see. I don't want to cause trouble for you. This town is your home now, and your reputation—" "Mr. Elliott," she interrupted, a flash of steel in her green eyes, "my reputation is built on my character and my work, not on the whispers of bored housewives. I tended your wound because it needed tending, and I would do so again without hesitation." Preston was taken aback by her firmness. "Still, people talk. Let them." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you know why I came west, Preston? Because in Charleston, I was drowning in propriety. After the war, after losing my fiancée at Gettysburg, I was expected to mourn appropriately, then quietly become some cousin's wife or someone's spinster sister-in-law. I came here to be free of those constraints." The passion in her voice stirred something in Preston. "I understand wanting to escape the past." Her expression softened. "I believe you do." She glanced toward the general store where Thomas was visible through the window, admiring something on the counter. "Would you and Thomas join me for supper this evening? I have a stew that's far too much for one person." Preston hesitated, aware of the very gossip they'd just discussed. Katherine seemed to read his thoughts. "We can eat on the front porch of my cottage, in full view of the entire town." Completely proper. A smile broke across Preston's face. "In that case, we accept. Thomas will be thrilled." That evening, Preston found himself seated in a rocking chair on Katherine's small porch, watching as she and Thomas worked together to set a table. Her cottage sat at the edge of town, a modest structure with a small garden just beginning to show green shoots. "Miss Jenkins says these are going to be tomatoes," Thomas explained, pointing to the seedlings, "and those are beans. She says I can help pick them when they're ready." "That's very kind of her," Preston said, his eyes meeting Katherine's over his son's head. "It's entirely selfish," she replied with a smile. "I need a tall, strong young man to reach the high beans." Thomas puffed out his chest. "I'm growing every day. Pa says soon I'll be tall as him." The simple meal of rabbit stew, fresh bread, and apple preserves was the most enjoyable Preston had experienced in years. Katherine drew Thomas out, asking about his interests and listening with genuine attention to his stories about the ranch and the animals he loved. As dusk settled and Thomas began to yawn, Preston knew it was time to leave. "We should head home," he said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Katherine." "It was my pleasure, truly." She knelt to Thomas's level. "And thank you for your help with the table, Thomas. Perhaps you'd like to come help me in the garden sometime." "Can I, Pa?" Thomas looked up hopefully. "We'll see," Preston replied, not wanting to impose further. "You have your chores at home, too." As they prepared to leave, Katherine touched Preston's arm lightly. "Would you mind stopping by tomorrow after school? I have some books that might interest Thomas, stories about horses in the West." "We'd like that," Preston said, keenly aware of her hand still resting on his arm. For the first time in 3 years, he walked home with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the setting sun at his back. The next few weeks established a pattern. Preston would walk Thomas to school in the morning, work through the day, then return to walk him home. Often, they would stop at Katherine's cottage, where Thomas would help in the garden while Preston and Katherine talked on the porch. Preston learned that Katherine had come from a once wealthy Charleston family that had lost everything in the war. She'd trained as a teacher afterward, working in several cities before answering the advertisement for Cottonwood Springs. In turn, he shared stories of his years as a ranger, his marriage to Sarah, and the cattle ranch he'd built and lost. He found himself opening up about Sarah's illness, about the helplessness he'd felt watching her slip away, and about his fears of raising Thomas alone. "You've done remarkably well," Katherine assured him one evening as they watched Thomas carefully watering the garden rose. "He's kind, intelligent, and has a good heart. That comes from you." "And from his mother," Preston added softly. "Sometimes I look at him and see her so clearly it takes my breath away." Katherine was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she would approve of you moving forward?" The question hung in the air between them. Preston turned to look at her directly, taking in the soft curve of her cheek in the golden evening light. "Yes," he said finally. "Sarah made me promise to live, not just exist. It's taken me 3 years to understand what she meant." Katherine's eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. Before either could speak, Thomas called out excitedly, "Miss Jenkins! Pa, look! The first tomato flower!" The moment passed, but something had changed. As they left that evening, Preston impulsively took Katherine's hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. "Thank you," he said simply. She blushed, a smile playing at her lips. "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow." The town, predictably, buzzed with gossip about the widower and the schoolteacher. Some, like Mrs. Whitfield, clucked disapprovingly. Others, like Sheriff Wade, observed with quiet approval. "About time," Wade commented one afternoon as he and Preston repaired the jail's broken door. "Life's too short and too hard out here to deny yourself happiness when it comes along." Preston hammered a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. "Nothing's happened," Wade chuckled. "Yet." As spring gave way to summer, the school term ended. Katherine continued to teach some of the children, including Thomas, during the warmer months, focusing on practical skills and nature study. Preston found more reasons to join these expeditions: a fishing trip to the creek, a nature walk to identify plants, a picnic where Katherine taught the children to identify bird calls. On a warm July evening, Preston invited Katherine to the ranch for supper, the first time he'd extended such an invitation. Thomas was beside himself with excitement, running through the small house 3 times to ensure everything was perfect. "Do you think Miss Jenkins will like the flowers I picked?" he asked anxiously, eyeing the wildflowers he'd arranged in an old jar. "They're beautiful, son. She'll love them." Preston surveyed their humble home with new eyes, seeing the worn furniture and simple furnishings. Katherine had never complained about her modest cottage, but Preston suddenly felt the poverty of his own circumstances keenly. Those concerns vanished when Katherine arrived, her face lighting up as she took in the small ranch house and the effort they'd made. Thomas proudly presented his flowers and insisted on giving her a tour, showing off everything from the chicken coop to his favorite climbing tree. After a simple meal, as dusk descended, Thomas began to nod off at the table. Preston carried him to bed, tucking him in as Katherine watched from the doorway. "He wanted to stay awake," Preston explained as they moved to the front porch. "He was afraid he'd miss something." "He's had a big day," Katherine said, settling onto the bench Preston had built years ago for Sarah. "Your home is lovely, Preston." He laughed softly. "It's humble at best, nothing like what you must have known in Charleston." "That world doesn't exist anymore." She gazed out at the purpling sky. "And if it did, I wouldn't want to return to it. There's an honesty here that I cherish." Preston sat beside her, acutely aware of her nearness. "Katherine, I need to be honest with you about something." She turned to him, her expression open. Yes? The ranch is failing. The words were difficult to say aloud. The drought 2 years ago killed most of my cattle. I've been working odd jobs, but it's not enough. I've been thinking about selling, moving somewhere with better prospects. I see. Her voice was carefully neutral. And where would you go? I don't know. He ran a hand through his hair. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere with more rain, more opportunity. Katherine was silent for a long moment. And what does Thomas think of this plan? I haven't told him yet. I wanted to be sure before I upset his world again. She nodded slowly. And now? Are you sure? Preston looked at her, studying the face that had become so dear to him. No, he admitted. I'm not sure of anything except that I don't want to leave you. The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Katherine's hand found his in the gathering darkness. Then don't. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Preston leaned forward until their lips met in a gentle kiss. Katherine's hand tightened around his as she responded, her lips soft and yielding beneath his own. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to feel this way again, he whispered. Nor did I, she replied, her voice slightly tremulous. After James died at Gettysburg, I thought that part of my life was over. Preston brushed a strand of hair from her face. And now I find myself hoping it's just beginning. She smiled, then glanced toward the house. But we have Thomas to consider. This affects him too. He adores you, Preston said simply, and I him. But children can be complicated. He may not want to share his father's affections. Preston considered this. Thomas has been asking me for weeks why I don't marry you so you can be his new mother. Katherine laughed, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. Has he now? Rather presumptuous of him? He gets that from me, Preston admitted, taking both her hands in his. Katherine, I'm not a wealthy man. I can't offer you the life you might have had back east. But if you'd consider... A sharp crack interrupted him, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. The bullet splintered the porch post inches from Katherine's head. Preston reacted instantly, pulling Katherine to the floor of the porch. Stay down, he ordered, crawling to the door and kicking it open. Inside, quickly. They scrambled into the house as another shot rang out, shattering a window. Preston doused the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Thomas, Katherine whispered urgently, I'll get him. Preston moved silently through the familiar space, reaching his son's room. Thomas was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. Pa? What was that noise? Come here, son, Preston whispered, gathering the boy in his arms. We need to be very quiet. He carried Thomas to the main room, where Katherine waited by the wall, away from the windows. Preston set Thomas down beside her. Stay here. Don't move. He retrieved his rifle from above the fireplace and checked that it was loaded. Preston, what's happening? Katherine's voice was steady despite her fear. Someone's out there. He peered carefully around the edge of the curtain. The moonlight revealed nothing but shadows. I'm going around back. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, take Thomas and run for the root cellar. I'm scared, Pa, Thomas whispered, clutching Katherine's skirt. Preston knelt before his son. I know, but Miss Jenkins will keep you safe. Remember what I told you about being brave? Thomas nodded, his small face solemn in the darkness. Doing what's right even when you're scared. That's right. Preston touched his cheek gently, then looked up at Katherine. 5 minutes. She nodded, pulling Thomas closer to her side. Preston slipped out the back door, keeping low and moving silently around the perimeter of the house. Years of ranger training hadn't been forgotten. He blended with the shadows, rifle ready. A movement near the barn caught his attention. Someone was crouched behind the water trough. Preston circled wide, using the cover of the corral fence. That's far enough, Elliott. The voice came from behind him, accompanied by the click of a hammer being cocked. Preston froze, recognizing the voice. Cartwright. Turn around, slow. Preston did as instructed, finding himself facing a tall man with a prominent scar running down his left cheek, Lewis Cartwright, Harker's former partner and one of the few outlaws who'd escaped the Texas Rangers justice years ago. "Been a long time," Cartwright said, his revolver aimed steadily at Preston's chest. "Took me a while to track you down after Harker got himself killed." "Harker was a fool," Preston replied evenly. "There never was any money. The Rangers returned every dollar to the bank." Cartwright's laugh was humorless. "You expect me to believe that? Harker said you took a saddlebag full of cash. Said you were the only one who knew where the rest was hidden. He lied." "Maybe." Cartwright stepped closer. "Or maybe you're lying. Either way, I'm not leaving empty-handed. Where's the boy?" Preston felt ice in his veins. "What do you want with my son?" "Insurance. You're going to give me what I want, or I'm taking the boy. Simple as that." "There is no money," Preston insisted, his mind racing. "There never was." "Then I guess I'm taking the boy." Cartwright gestured with his gun. "Call him out, now." "No." Preston's grip tightened on his rifle. "I'll kill you where you stand, Elliott. Then I'll go in and get him myself." "You'll have to kill me first," Preston said, his voice deadly calm. "And I promise you, I won't make it easy." For a tense moment, they stood facing each other in the moonlight. Then a new voice broke the silence. "Drop your weapon." Sheriff Wade emerged from the shadows behind Cartwright, his shotgun leveled. "It's over." Cartwright didn't move. "You're outnumbered, Sheriff. I've got men positioned all around the property." "You mean the two by the barn?" Wade asked. "Already taken care of. And the one by the road? He's sleeping off a nasty knock to the head." Preston saw the doubt flicker in Cartwright's eyes, but the outlaw's gun remained steady. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Wade took another step closer. "Drop the gun, Cartwright. You're not taking anyone tonight." For a moment, it seemed Cartwright might surrender. Then his face twisted with rage, and he swung his gun toward Wade. Preston fired a split second before Cartwright could pull his trigger. The outlaw staggered backward, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. Wade rushed forward, kicking Cartwright's gun away and checking for signs of life. "Dead," he announced after a moment. "You always were a good shot, Elliott." Preston lowered his rifle, suddenly aware of his racing heart. "How did you know?" "Got word from the marshal in Cheyenne this morning. Cartwright and his gang were spotted heading this way." Wade stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Figured he might come after you given what Harker's man said before he died." The front door of the house opened, and Katherine appeared, holding Thomas, who clung to her neck. "Preston," she called, her voice trembling. "It's all right," he answered, moving quickly toward them. "It's over." He took Thomas from her arms, holding his son tight against his chest as Katherine wrapped her arms around them both. Over Thomas's head, Preston's eyes met Wade's. "Thank you," he said simply. Wade nodded. "I'll take care of this. You take care of them." Later, after the bodies had been removed and Thomas had finally fallen asleep again, Preston and Katherine sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly together. "It's truly over now," Preston said. "Cartwright was the last one who knew about the Galveston job, the last one who thought I had money hidden away." "Will there be others?" Katherine asked, her face pale in the lamplight. "Other men from your past?" Preston shook his head. "No. My time as a ranger is long behind me. Most of the outlaws we hunted are dead or in prison now." Katherine's grip on his hand tightened. "When I heard that shot, I thought—" her voice broke. "I thought I'd lost you before I ever truly had you." Preston lifted her hand to his lips. "Katherine, before we were interrupted, I was trying to ask you something important." A small smile played at her lips despite the tears in her eyes. "Were you?" "I was saying that I'm not a wealthy man. The ranch is struggling. But I love you. And if you could consider sharing this life with me with us, I would spend every day trying to make you happy." Katherine's smile widened. "Preston Elliott, are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." He met her gaze steadily. "Will you?" She leaned forward and kissed him softly. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I will." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in Cottonwood's small church. Most of the town attended, even Mrs. Whitfield, who had apparently decided that a schoolteacher marrying a former Texas Ranger was acceptable after all, especially when that Ranger had recently rid the territory of dangerous outlaws. Thomas stood proudly beside his father, clutching the small cushion that held the ring's simple gold bands that Preston had purchased with money earned from selling 2 of his horses. As Preston watched Katherine walk toward him down the short aisle, dressed in a simple ivory gown with wildflowers in her hair, he felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for too long. The ceremony was brief, the celebration afterward joyful but modest. As the sun set, Preston and Katherine stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the yard. "Are you happy?" Preston asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Katherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "Completely. Are you?" "More than I thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I was so focused on the past, on what I'd lost. I never imagined I could find something this precious again." "The past shapes us," Katherine said, watching Thomas with affection, "but it doesn't have to define us." Preston nodded, thinking of all the paths that had led them to this moment: the war, his time as a ranger, Sarah's death, Katherine's journey west. So much pain and loss, yet somehow it had brought them together. "Pa, Katherine!" Thomas called, running toward them with his hands cupped around something. "Look what I caught!" He opened his palms carefully to reveal a glowing firefly. "Isn't it beautiful?" Katherine knelt beside him. "It certainly is, but you know, sometimes the most beautiful things need to be free." Thomas considered this, then nodded solemnly. He opened his hands fully, and they watched as the firefly rose into the darkening sky, its light pulsing as it flew away. "Just like that," Katherine whispered, meeting Preston's eyes over Thomas's head. The following morning, Preston walked Thomas to the schoolhouse for the first day of the new term. Katherine had left earlier to prepare the classroom, insisting on maintaining propriety by not arriving with them on her first day as both teacher and Mrs. Elliott. As they approached the schoolhouse, Preston noticed Thomas was unusually quiet. "Something on your mind, son?" Thomas kicked at a stone in the path. "Do I still call her Miss Jenkins at school? Or is she Mrs. Elliott now? Or," he hesitated, "could I call her Ma? Not at school, but at home?" Preston's heart constricted. "What do you think she'd say if you asked her?" "I don't know." Thomas looked up, his expression serious. "My real Ma is in heaven. I don't want her to be sad if I call Katherine Ma, too." Preston stopped walking and knelt to look his son in the eyes. "Thomas, your mother loved you more than anything in this world. The last thing she said to me was that she wanted you to be happy. I think she'd be glad you have someone like Katherine in your life." "Really?" "Really." Preston straightened. "Why don't you ask Katherine what she'd like you to call her? I think she'll be honored no matter what you decide." When they reached the schoolhouse, Katherine was greeting the children as always. Her face brightened when she saw them. "Good morning, Thomas. Are you ready for a new school year?" Thomas nodded, then blurted out, "Can I call you Ma? Not at school, but at home." Katherine's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She knelt, opening her arms, and Thomas stepped into her embrace. "I would be honored," she whispered, holding him tight. "So very honored." Preston watched them, his throat tight with emotion. When Katherine looked up at him over Thomas's head, the love in her eyes made his heart swell. After a moment, she composed herself and straightened. "Now then, Mr. Elliott, Thomas has a big day ahead. We're starting geography lessons today." Preston nodded, fighting back his own emotions. "He's in good hands. I know that." As Thomas prepared to join the other children filing into the schoolhouse, Katherine touched Preston's arm. "Will you be working at the Millers today?" "Yes, madam, fixing their roof before the fall rains come." "Be careful up there." Her concern was evident. "Thomas and I need you in one piece." Preston smiled. "I'll be home for supper." "We'll be waiting?" She kissed his cheek quickly, mindful of the children watching. As Preston turned to leave, the schoolteacher called after him, "Mr. Elliott." He looked back. Katherine stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, Thomas by her side. Her smile was radiant in the morning sunlight. "He'll do fine today," she said, "just like his father." Preston tipped his hat, his heart full. As he walked toward town, he found himself thinking not of the past, but of the future, of the life they would build together, the family they had become. That evening, as he walked home with the setting sun warming his back, Preston spotted Thomas running to meet him, Katherine following at a more sedate pace, her hand resting lightly on her stomach in a gesture he recognized from years ago. Later, when Thomas was asleep and they sat together on the porch, Katherine confirmed what Preston had suspected. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat abdomen. "Are you certain?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Dr. Collins confirmed it today. Next spring, Thomas will have a little brother or sister." Preston pulled her close, overwhelmed by gratitude. "I never thought I'd have this again, a family, a future, hope." "Nor did I," Katherine admitted. "After James died, I thought that door had closed forever." "And now?" she smiled, placing her hand over his. "Now I believe some doors close so that others can open. And Preston Elliott, the door that led me to you and Thomas, is the best one I've ever walked through." As autumn gave way to winter, the small ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Katherine's teaching salary provided stability, while Preston worked to rebuild the cattle herd. Thomas thrived, excelling in school and growing more confident by the day. When heavy snow blanketed Cottonwood Springs in December, the three of them spent long evenings by the fire, Katherine reading aloud while Preston carved wooden animals for Thomas and the coming baby, Thomas sketching increasingly impressive pictures of horses and western scenes. "You have a real gift," Katherine told him one evening, studying his latest drawing. "Perhaps someday you could illustrate books about the West." Thomas considered this possibility with wide eyes. "Books like the ones you read to us?" "Exactly like those." Preston watched them, marveling at how seamlessly Katherine had become part of their lives, filling empty spaces he hadn't even realized existed. As Katherine's pregnancy progressed, the town rallied around them. Women who had once gossiped about the schoolteacher now brought quilts and baby clothes. The men helped Preston build, in addition to the house, a proper bedroom for Thomas and a small nursery. Sheriff Wade, who had become a regular visitor, helped install a new window in the nursery one cold February afternoon. "Never thought I'd see the day," he commented as they worked. "Preston Elliott, family man and respected citizen." Preston laughed. "Surprised me, too." "You deserve it," Wade said, suddenly serious. "After everything you did as a ranger, all the bad men you put away, you earned this peace." By spring, Katherine's condition required her to step back from teaching. Miss Caroline took over the classroom, while Katherine focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. On a warm May morning, as dawn broke over the mountains, Katherine went into labor. Preston sent Thomas to fetch the midwife, then held his wife's hand through the long hours that followed. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "Just like you do everything." Katherine managed to smile despite her pain. "I'm glad. You think so, because this hurts considerably more than geography lessons." As the sun began to set, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Preston's eyes. The midwife cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing her in Katherine's arms. "She's perfect," Katherine whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes. "Look what we did, Preston." Preston could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The baby had a dusting of dark hair and Katherine's determined chin. "What shall we call her?" Katherine asked. Preston thought for a moment. "Sarah," he said softly, "for her first mother, if that's all right with you." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect. Sarah Katherine Elliott." Thomas, who had been waiting anxiously outside with Sheriff Wade, was allowed in to meet his sister. He approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide. "She's so small," he whispered. "But she'll grow," Preston assured him, "and she'll need her big brother to teach her all sorts of important things." Thomas nodded solemnly, accepting this responsibility. "I'll teach her about horses and how to draw," Katherine smiled tiredly. "I'm sure she'll appreciate that." That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep in his new room and Katherine dozed with the baby beside her, Preston stood at the window, looking out at the land that was now truly home. The ranch was beginning to prosper again. New calves dotted the pasture, and the garden Katherine had planted was thriving. In town, he was no longer the quiet widower, but a respected citizen with a place in the community. Most importantly, inside these walls was a family: his son, his wife, his newborn daughter. A family built not just of blood, but of choice, of love that had overcome loss and distance and danger. As if sensing his thoughts, Katherine stirred. "Preston, is everything all right?" He turned from the window and moved to sit beside her on the bed, gently touching their daughter's cheek. "Everything is perfect," he assured her. "I was just thinking about how fortunate I am." "We all are," Katherine murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. "All four of us." 5 years later, Preston once again walked his son to the schoolhouse. Thomas, now 11, was tall for his age, his stride confident as he carried his books and slate. "Pa, do you think Miss Caroline will let me help with the younger children's drawing lessons again today?" Thomas asked as they approached the familiar building. "If you finish your own work first," Preston replied. "Your mother won't be pleased if your arithmetic suffers because you're too busy teaching." Thomas grinned. "Ma always knows when I haven't done my sums. She says I get the same look you do when you're trying to avoid something." Preston laughed, acknowledging the truth of this. Katherine, now the school superintendent overseeing 3 schools in the county, remained acutely attuned to both her children's educational progress. As they reached the schoolhouse, Miss Caroline greeted them warmly. "Good morning, Thomas. Your mother mentioned you might help with the art lesson this afternoon." Thomas beamed. "Yes, madam." "Run along inside," she said. "Billy and James are already waiting for you." As Thomas disappeared into the schoolhouse, Miss Caroline turned to Preston. "He's a remarkable boy, Mr. Elliott. His drawings are better than most adults could manage, and he has such patience with the younger children." "He gets that from his mother," Preston said with a smile. "Both mothers, in fact." "He'll do fine today," Miss Caroline assured him, "just like his father." The familiar words still warmed Preston's heart after all these years. "Thank you, Miss Caroline." As he walked back toward town, Preston reflected on how much had changed. Cottonwood Springs had grown, boasting a proper hotel now and even a small bank. The railroad had come through 2 years earlier, bringing new opportunities and connecting them more closely to the wider world. Sheriff Wade, now married to the widow Johnson, had finally gotten a proper deputy, allowing him occasional days off. The outlaw days were largely behind them, though there were still occasional troubles: drunken cowboys or disputes over cattle and water rights. Preston's own ranch had prospered, growing to 3 times its original size. With Katherine's business sense and his hard work, they'd built something substantial, a legacy for their children. At home, little Sarah waited with her mother. At 5 years old, she was the image of Katherine, with the same auburn hair and determined spirit, though Preston often saw echoes of his first wife in her smile. As he approached the house, Sarah spotted him from her perch on the porch swing and ran to meet him, her pigtails flying behind her. "Papa, did Thomas go to school? Can I go to school too? Mama's been teaching me my letters." Preston swung her up into his arms, marveling as always at the miracle of this second chance at fatherhood. "Is that so? And what letters do you know?" "All of them," she declared proudly, "A through Z." "All of them? My word, you'll be teaching school yourself before long." Katherine appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. At 35, she was more beautiful than ever to Preston's eyes, her face softened by years of happiness. "Don't encourage her," she said with mock severity. "She already informed me this morning that she doesn't need to learn arithmetic because she's going to be a famous artist like Thomas." Preston set Sarah down. Is that so? Well, even famous artists need to know their numbers. How else will they know if they're being paid fairly for their work? Sarah considered this logic, then nodded gravely. I suppose I'll learn them after all. A wise decision, Katherine said, bending to kiss the top of her daughter's head. Now, why don't you go check if the chickens have laid any eggs? As Sarah scampered off toward the chicken coop, Katherine stepped into Preston's embrace. How was Thomas this morning? Still excited about the art contest? Practically bouncing with it, Preston confirmed. Miss Caroline says he'll be helping with the younger children's drawing lessons today. Katherine smiled against his shoulder. He's growing up so fast, both of them are. That they are. Preston held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. But we're growing old together, just like we promised. She pulled back to look at him, her green eyes sparkling. Old? Speak for yourself, Mr. Elliott. I'm in the prime of my life. That you are, Mrs. Elliott. He kissed her softly. And I fall more in love with you every day. From the chicken coop came Sarah's excited cry. Mama! Papa! 7 eggs today! A new record! They broke apart, laughing, and went to admire their daughter's discovery. As Preston watched Katherine help Sarah carefully place the eggs in her basket, he felt a completeness that once seemed impossible. The past would always be part of him, his years as a ranger, his first love, the struggles and losses, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was this home, this family, this love that had found him when he least expected it. That evening, the 4 of them sat on the porch as the sun set over the mountains. Thomas sketched in his book while Sarah leaned against Katherine, drowsy after a day of exploration. Preston watched them, his heart full to bursting. What are you thinking about? Katherine asked softly, noticing his expression. Preston smiled, reaching across to take her hand. I'm thinking that some men search their whole lives for treasure, not realizing it's right in front of them all along. And have you found your treasure, Preston Elliott? He squeezed her hand, looking at their children, their home, and the life they'd built together. Yes, he said simply. I have. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Preston knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, not just surviving, but truly living, surrounded by the love that had healed his broken heart and given him a second chance at happiness in the wild Wyoming territory he now called home.